Hi, I'm Regard.
And I'm Marie, and we're part of the InterAction Collective.
The InterAction Collective is a service for people of color, by people of color, with people of color that was created after hearing from a lot of research that we conducted where students would tell us that racist things would happen in their schools, stuff would go on, no one was held accountable, nothing was done to fix it, and it was frustrating for the students. So we wanted a safe space for people of color to exist, to be educated on certain things, like their own histories, different stuff, in a safe space that allowed them to just kind of be themselves.
Today we're welcoming LeRoi Newbold from Black Lives Matter Toronto. He founded the Freedom School, which is a pro-Black education curricula. It's a 3-week program that teaches people about their histories and about tools for resistance. So we did this because we found that a lot of students of color in London feel very erased from the histories that are taught within their school. So we wanted to give individuals an opportunity to learn about a different way that we can talk about our histories and integrate them both within community education and potentially within our school's educational system.
And that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Marie. I am one of the members of the InterAction Collective, which is actually Regat's going to introduce what we do a bit later. I'm just going to start with the land acknowledgement. So today we want to acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenni Lenape, and Adarwan people, who have a long-standing relationship to the land and region of Southwest Ontario and the City of London. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, specifically Treaty 6 of 1796, also known as the London Township Treaty of the Upper Canada Land Surrenders. The local First Nation communities of this area include the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. In the region, there are 11 First Nation communities and a growing Indigenous urban population. The InterAction Collective recognizes the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original people of Turtle Island. Okay.
I'll put on my glasses so I can see you. So thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate everyone being here. This mic is real loud. Basically, the InterAction Collective, which is the collective that's holding this event, is a service that's basically by people of color, for people of color, and made with people of color. And we came out of a research project that essentially talked to students of color around London, basically asking them their experience as a racialized youth in London, and they told us all the stuff we already knew, which is that people were racist, things would happen in schools, no one was held accountable, teachers wouldn't do anything, and all you were learning is white history and whitewashed history. And so basically from that, a year later, we're here providing you with the wonderful people of the and Toronto. And thank you guys for coming to the event. We're here to serve all people of color in London.
So without further ado, we're going to welcome LeRoi Newbold from Black Lives Matter Toronto. He founded the Freedom School.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Freedom School and the work that we do with that, and also intervening in anti-Black racism in the public education system in Toronto. Okay, thank you. So here's our babies. This is just a snapshot of them outside of the US consulate in 2016, I think it was. The first year of Freedom School. And at Freedom School, the end of it always culminates with some kind of action, because they are learning about Black histories of resistance, but also about community organizing. So here they had a campaign that they created around prison abolition and prisoners' justice. And so they're protesting outside of the US consulate. So we'll talk a little bit more about the journey that it took them to get there. But first I kind of want to just lay the foundation of the context in which we do this work. So probably there are similar issues just from hearing quick snippets here in London, but in Toronto, there's a well-documented context of anti-Black racism in the school system, and it operates in a lot of different ways. And I kind of think about it like our children in the education system being a little bit like a caged bird. So what I mean by that is like we have a 40% push-out rate in Toronto for Black youth. So 40% of Black youth don't graduate from high school in Toronto. We also have really high rates of suspensions and expulsions. So I think Black youth are 6 times more likely than any other youth to be expelled from school, and much more likely to be suspended as well. And then beyond that, there's also a lot of disengagement. So the curriculum happens in a way that's very disengaging for a lot of our youth. And from the outside looking in, it kind of looks as though our youth are not succeeding in the system. But we want to encourage people to look closer to see what the actual barriers are, so that we can understand what's actually impacting them. So we've done a lot of work with Black parents and youth about what some of those barriers are, and we've looked at things like curriculum, and we've also looked at things like punitive discipline. So the reasons for those high expulsions and high suspension rates. And when we started talking to parents, that was kind of the largest issue that came forward. 100% of parents said that the discipline procedures and policies of their child's school don't meet their needs. Yeah, we are looking at developing some alternate kinds of ways of not doing discipline, but dealing with students. And the biggest part of that that we looked at was involving community in the actual creation of curriculum and education. So that was the first step of creating Freedom School, was us as Black parents and youth sitting down together and talking about what it is that we think it's important to learn. So in first sitting down to do that, we talked to youth about what they typically learn about Blackness in their regular school day. Most of them said they didn't learn anything about Blackness at school. Some of them said that they learned a little bit about it during Black History Month. And of those who said they did learn about it during Black History Month, most said they learned about enslavement or Martin Luther King Jr. And further than that, with the perspective through which they learn about enslavement, most of them talked about learning about it through a perspective that's very, where they were almost like objects. Like I remember when I was in school and I was learning about enslavement, there was like a big picture that they showed us of a ship. And it showed how many bodies were packed into the ship, and each body was represented by like a little dot. And it was really meant to show like the magnitude of harm that happened during that period, and the way that Black people were kind of like treated like chattel. But what happened was the image was very, very disempowering, because all of our bodies are just represented as dots. And so with Freedom School, we wanted to look at, like, even if we do talk about oppression and we do talk about anti-Blackness, what are the images that we'll show and what will be the perspective that we look at that. So we would show images, for example, of a slave revolt, and we talk about what's the difference between seeing images of those little black dots versus images of people actually actively resisting at every point in their history, even when they're extremely oppressed. So that's kind of was our point of departure. Freedom School started in 2016 with doing consultations with Black parents and youth about what the program would look like. And then from there, one of the first things that we realized in wanting to teach our kids about Black liberation here in Canada and also like globally was the lack of resources. So since like part of the reason that a lot of Black youth and kids talked about learning about Martin Luther King Jr. was because a lot of the resources that people are accessing are American-based resources. So even those limited resources that do talk about our resistance histories are usually from an American perspective. So one of the first things we started doing was working with artists like Kike, who didn't mention this when I said talk about the work you do, but artists that actually started creating like a portfolio of work to talk about our histories. So we started creating things like animations about Africville and video games about the Black Lives Matter movement. And we really wanted to create something that would be engaging for our kids. Because like, as a parent, I often feel like I'm up against so much, and I'm up against a system that's backed by so much propaganda with so much money that goes into it. And like, I might tell my kid like, you know, about their self-worth and about having pride in self, but then they'll watch movies that, you know, have multi-billion-dollar budgets that really tell them otherwise. So we really wanted to create resources that would be engaging. And that was kind of the reason that we chose the arts-based approach. As well as in those initial times when we were sitting down with youth, some of them told us like, things are so overwhelming right now. A lot of the times in the morning, you know, I open up my social media and it will just be like pages and pages of names of Black people that are being killed by police. And at a certain point, I kind of turn off emotionally to be able to cope with that. And it was actually one of the youths who said, it's really just art that makes me be able to engage and makes me be able to like access my emotions around it sometimes. So that's the reason that we decided to go with the arts-based approach. So this is one of the resources that we created. It's a puzzle. It says Black Kids Lives Matter. And it's really just, especially with our youngest freedom fighters, they are 4 to 6 years old. And we really just want to intervene into that kind of feed or stream that they're getting from the news that they're hearing. And you know, the way that people are talking on the streets about issues that are going around. And that kind of news feed really devalues their life. To grow up in a world where you know that people who look like you, who are young like you, even kids like you, could be shot and with impunity, with nothing happening to the, you know, state official that perpetrated that is a really disturbing thing. So we wanted to, you know, intervene into that stream. And this is where like a lot of times people ask us about the age appropriateness of talking about things like state violence and police brutality. But as a Black person, it's like, that's always kind of part of what you grow up seeing and hearing and being exposed to. So we just really want to give them the tools to be able to understand. Because I find that when you don't have the tools to really analyze something or deconstruct it, you have a tendency to internalize it. So you'll think like, maybe I'm always getting in trouble at school because I'm bad, or you know, because I'm not smart, or it must be something about me because every class I go into it's happening. So we want them to be able to analyze things at a high level, like politically analyze things. So this is also one of the resources that we created. It's a workbook, and it's a workbook, and it talks about Black liberation history in Canada through the 80s and 90s into now. And it also talks about Black liberation history around the world. So it talks about things like the Malay Revolt in Brazil, and like the Maroons in Jamaica. It talks about Oromo resistance in Ethiopia. And with this resource and with our curriculum, we really started with like who our kids were. Because I find like, even when you're growing up in public school and you're learning about Blackness, a lot of times your actual identity is totally invisibilized because it will just be like, the American focus. So we wanted to be able to tell them stories that they could be like, oh yeah, like my grandma told me something about that, or that really relates to my life. Okay, and our youngest freedom fighter program is really focused on like self-love and pride in self, and just like building up that confidence in yourself and being able to advocate for yourself. And it focuses on transformative justice too. So transformative justice, like the best analogy that I've heard, I think, to explain it is like punitive justice would be like, if I was like, you stole my radio, you have to go to jail. Restorative justice would be like, if I was like, you stole my radio, you have to say sorry and give it back. And transformative justice would be like, you stole my radio, I'm sorry that you didn't have a radio, how can we make sure that you and everybody in your community has radios too? So this is really the approach that we use to deal with student conflicts between each other, or even conflicts between staff and kids. We use a model of asking them what's going on for them if they have a problem with somebody, but also we try to understand what creates the conditions for violence or for acting out. And so that really starts from, like when we first started the project and we sat down to ask them, what do you want to learn about? We don't want to end up in a situation where they sit down with the materials and they're like, this is boring, I don't care about this. Like we wanted them to be involved every step of the way. So, and then we will have those circles like when issues come up, even with our very, very youngest ones, where we'll be asking them, what happened between you? How do you feel like your relationship is? How do you feel like this person treats you in general? How do you feel like the teacher treats you, or the educator? Do you feel powerful here? Do you feel like you have everything that you need to be successful here? Do you feel like your family belongs here? Like we really want them to feel like they have power in the situation. And if there's a problem that comes up, we don't want to just take it at face value. It's kind of like when I grew up in Alberta as like a queer black kid, very queer. And like, I remember this one day I threw a chair at somebody in my class. And I was like in big trouble for that, but I was like, y'all don't understand, like this person is like irritating me and bothering me and harassing me and putting me down every single day. And up until this point where I exploded, nobody really cared about that. It just wasn't as part of the schooling experiences of a lot of black kids, especially those with disabilities, those who are queer or trans, those who are poor, those who have intersectional marginalized identities. So we want this to be a different kind of space for them, and it is. For some of them, it's the first schooling space where they actually feel comfortable, where they actually feel like, this is a space they can learn. So my child made this, so that's what is part of this. Oh, and what it is her vision for a school. So we asked them, if you had a freedom school, what kind of things would you want to be part of it? And then they kind of added that and created this banner for their school. So I talked a little bit earlier about the arts-based curriculum, and it's a very broadly defined arts-based. So we do like visual arts. Last year we did a show that was focused on voguing and the contributions of like trans and queer black people in the ballroom scene to black liberation. And then this picture they're doing capoeira. So what it is a martial arts that people learned in Brazil during enslavement, and basically fighting or learning how to be trained as a fighter was outlawed because it's enslavement. You can't just learn how to like fight an uprising against your captor. So capoeira was like a secret way of training fighters. It looked like it was just a dance, but it was actually a lethal, form of fighting. but it also involves music, and it also is very artistic. And so we used it to teach them like the history behind it. And this is one of the kids. I think this is their first time doing capoeira. Okay. So because of the transformative justice lens that we try to take, again with trying to understand like what leads to different kinds of schooling experiences or conditions, we have to look at disabilities justice. There is no way that that couldn't be, like, that would not be part of the conversation. So we look at it. It might be dead. Okay, I'll go a cappella in the meantime. So we look at disabilities justice from an educator perspective in terms of planning, trying to think of how to make the program the most accessible possible. So right now, all of the Freedom School staff, I think actually, are doing like our ASL, first level ASL course. We have tried to look at like how to make the program accessible in terms of lots of different needs, from like students with ADHD to like physical disabilities to all kind of different disabilities. And we also look at it with the kids. So we try to let them think, because basically we want them to know how to be community organizers. We want them to know how to be resistors and how to be movement builders. And we want to teach them that the movements that we build should be accessible to everybody. So in this activity, they made their own playground. And within the playground, they're making equipment that's accessible for different kinds of disabilities. And it's really just a way to get them to think about like accessible spaces and what that means. But they also are encouraged to think about it in every step of what we're doing. So even how you saw them at the beginning doing like the protests, in planning it, they had to think about accessibility. So they had to calculate like, how much is ASL gonna cost? How are we gonna then utilize that cost by making sure that this event is actually outreach to deaf community? And so they get some practice in thinking about accessibility. Another key tenet of our program is Black and Indigenous solidarity. So in the first year of Freedom School, we thought of it a lot more in terms of solidarity, like building solidarity between Black and Indigenous communities in Canada. And what that means, we every year go out to the same place in Six Nations for them to like connect with Indigenous peoples and learn about land sustainability. And like they've kind of learned about it in terms of at an age appropriate level. So we talk about, you know, these peoples had this whole land, and then they were forced into a very small portions of the land, and they had to learn how to survive and take care of that land the best way that they could. And so some of the things that they've done are like building greenhouses and having community greenhouses, and yeah, so just having them talk about land sustainability and food sustainability. But I think the important thing is that like for a lot of Black kids growing up in Toronto or growing up in like urban area, it's the first time that they've met Indigenous people. Like literally when we started talking to them about it, they're like, Indigenous people, is that white people? We're like, no. They're like, is it Black people? We're like, no. They're like, I don't get it. So I think it's just like, it speaks a lot to how we're separated and then miseducated about each other, and that prevents us to be from being able to work together effectively to dismantle white supremacy. So we do believe that that's important. And as the years have gone by, we've kind of changed our framework for it, from just talking about solidarity to talking about indigeneity more broadly and in a global sense. So for example, last year we were talking about Oromo people's resistance in Ethiopia and how like the Ethiopian government was trying to displace indigenous people to be able to use their land and resources. We talked about the same thing with like Liberia, how they took American formerly enslaved people and shipped them to Liberia, and how those displaced like ex-enslaved people tried to displace indigenous people and take their resources. And they started to notice commonalities that would come up. There were like, in every place, indigenous people are fighting for access to their own land. In every place, they're fighting for access to speaking their own languages. And when they started to notice that, it's like we're building solidarity with other peoples. And really thinking about a kind of Black liberation that is global and that is decolonial. I'm sorry that looks like that. So that's a picture of them on Six Nations, and they're working with the beekeeper. She's like showing them how she like works with the bees and harvests honey and stuff like that. And honestly, like at the beginning, a lot of them were really freaked out. They're just like, they get out onto the land and they're like, oh my God, are we gonna die? Where are we? Like, and I think it's just like really beautiful that for them to be able to have that moment of reconnecting with land. And a lot of them like live in such a small, crunched up place. And they had an opportunity to then be like, you know, partnering with indigenous people to talk about taking care of land and also being able to access that, which is so important for your mental health. So can you still hear me? Is that still okay? Okay.
Sorry, they're both dead.
It's all right. That's fine. So food justice is also really, really important for what we do. A big part of the program, well, Freedom School is really inspired by the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense Oakland Community School and the work that they did with that. And really what they did is create survival programs for Black people. So they were like, we want to engage people in revolution, but right now people are trying to survive, literally trying to survive without being able to access healthcare, without having adequate housing, without having access to healthy foods. And so they created 28 programs to serve their people. And one of those programs had to do with education. And so they opened the Oakland Community School, and it wasn't only Black kids, it was like Black and Latinx kids together, learning about resistance. So, and as part of that, they fed the kids all their meals at school. They bused kids in. They made sure that a cost wasn't going to be a barrier to anybody participating in revolution. And so we wanted to do the same thing. We wanted to make the program accessible. So we serve snacks for the kids, we serve lunch, and we usually try to connect it to whatever it is that we're talking about. So on this particular day, we were learning about the Haitian Revolution, and here, one of the elders in community, maybe she would be mad if I said that. One of our community members was making soup jumu, and it's like the soup that Haitian people made on the Independence Day. It was supposed to be a soup that only like French people made, and then it was kind of like the final like fuck you when Haitians like expelled the French. They're like, and we're making this soup too. So we're making the soup, and we're talking to them about what the revolution looked like. And they're watching this like animation that some women in community made, and it's really hands-on way of learning and engaging way of learning. So we talked a little bit about the transformative justice element of the program too. We also do a lot of work around youth mentorship. Most of our programming is led by youth, like in terms of the Toronto definition, 30 and under youth. But we also do involve teenagers in what we're doing. So last year for the transformative justice team, we train some teenagers in using transformative justice practices. So they use those, like if we're facilitating the circle, they will be the ones to mostly run the circle, and everyone else, like the adults, will mostly just sit back. Unless the conflict involves physical violence, then we will take a more active role. But for the most part, we will just sit back. And that's something that we also learned through like talking to people from the Black Panther Party about the Oakland Community School and the practices that they did. So in talking to them and their circles, they were saying, like, you know, here's an example. If one little girl had difficulty with doing her homework, they wouldn't do like any kind of detention or punishment. They would sit down, she would go to the youth, the Transformative Justice League. She would sit down with the youth and they would ask her, you know, why didn't you do your homework? And usually at first kids will be like, I don't know, I just didn't want to do it. I'll just be like, I don't know. And then the older kids would be like, you have to know, and we're gonna help you. And we would explicitly talk to the kids about always talking to younger people with love and compassion. Because you do sometimes see, like, when youth get into leadership roles, they will be like kind of mean sometimes. And it's because they're watching the adults in leadership roles and copying what they do. So we talk to them explicitly about you have to approach Black children with love. Black children are Black gold. You must love them. And so they'll sit down with the youth, they'll sit down with the kids and they will ask them what happened, and then after hearing whatever the issue was, they will suggest a course correction. And that's because we believe in education, not punishment. So instead of saying a punishment, they will ask them, okay, they will suggest, okay, how about every day when you go home from now on, you have to do your homework right away up until 4:30. You could take a break of half an hour if you want to. And if you have trouble, you can call me. Here's my number. You can call me. And then they'll have to come back and check in about how that correction went. And so, yeah, this is just a picture of one of our youth mentors chilling with like a younger kid and building those relationships. And then at the beginning, we talked about the community organizing aspect of the program. This is from the first year, and the first year they learned about Albert Woodbridge, who was somebody who was arrested during the Black Power movement and who was incarcerated for 40 years and who remains incarcerated in the United States. And our kids are so driven by justice. Like when they heard the story of him, they were like, 40 years for trying to fight for your freedom, that's not fair. You will always hear kids be like, that's not fair. So they decided to organize this action speaking out about him, being that his first chance for release was coming up, and speaking out and bringing attention to that issue. They also then connected that to what was happening in Lindsay, Ontario at the time. There were some prisoners that were on hunger strike because of the fact that you can be incarcerated and detained for like a time without any limit in Canada because of immigration status. So like in the United States, if you are detained because of immigration, and let's say, you know, the government where you're going back to can't find your passport, then they have 3 months to be detaining you, and then they have to let you out. In Canada, if you're being detained, let's say to Somalia, and the Somali government can't find any papers for you, because there aren't any papers, you could be detained endlessly. And some people are. Some people have been detained for 8 years because of that reason. And, you know, other countries, there's also other issues. So they learned about Lindsay, Ontario, and the hunger strike that prisoners were doing because of this immigration detention issue. So also, like, sometimes we do give them American reference points for things, but we also always try to make a link to Canada and what's going on here. We really want to intervene in that idea that Canada is like not as bad as the United States, particularly around anti-Black racism, because it's ridiculous. And it's also just not a good moral compass. Like in a country, if Black people are being shot every 8 to 28 hours, then we shouldn't really be looking at that country as a moral gauge for what's acceptable. And then another really important thing about Freedom School is just the opportunity to build family and with other Black kids and to talk about issues that are affecting them. A lot of them go to school with a lot of other Black kids, but some of them are like that only one Black kid who's just like in this whole class of white kids. So this gives them an opportunity to connect with other Black kids. Wow. So, like that's our work outside of the system, which is I think the most rewarding work that I have an opportunity to do. It never stresses me out, it never makes me exhausted or depressed. But in thinking about liberation work, you know, we can use imagination when doing work outside the system, but then our most vulnerable people are still inside of it a lot of the time. So our work is twofold, working with creating alternatives outside the system and also confronting the system itself. So this very blurry picture is of the first action that we did inside of against the Toronto District School Board. It was when a 13-year-old girl went to school and was told that she can't enter the school because her natural hair is not professional and it's not suited for the classroom. And so she was asked to leave the classroom. And it might, like, some people are like, oh, but this is something that happens really routinely around school uniforms. Just that idea of Blackness being like deviant or unprofessional. So I thought about this when I first heard about it, and I was like, yeah, things like this always happen, but how would it be different for the child if the next day they turned on the news and they saw that 100 people had gathered at the school board headquarters to say, your hair is beautiful and you are beautiful exactly the way you are. And also, we are gonna fight for you. We won't just accept this happening to you. So with this action, that was the idea of us gathering there, and that was also the first time that we put out a list of demands for the school systems in Ontario, including an end to school discipline practices that are influenced by racism, an end to any suspension or expulsion without a council of community to agree. And we also asked for an end to police in schools through the School Resource Officer Program. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So with that incident, the youth did end up having her principal apologize to her and her family. But we were like, this wasn't just one incident, it was really part of a systematic and systemic anti-Blackness within the system. So this was in 2017. This was the year, I'm not sure how many of y'all heard about this, but there was a 6-year-old girl in Mississauga, a 6-year-old Black girl who was handcuffed at school. So one day she was having like a meltdown, she was really upset, and because she wouldn't calm down, her school called the police. And when the police got there, they handcuffed her, not only by the wrists, but also by the ankles. And they waited there for her parents to come. But when I heard about that incident, it was just so disgusting to me. And I thought about like the level of trauma that happens to our kids within that system, being treated like criminals, basically. And a lot of us got together, like Black parents and kids and youth, and we're just like, no, this is enough. And for those of us who work inside the system, like I work on a regular day-to-day, I work in the Afrocentric school, so I work in the TDSB, and I was like, we should walk out. And that's what happened. On May Day, May 1st, 100 Black teachers, parents, and students walked out for the day. Speaking out about what happened to the little girl in Mississauga, but also speaking out about racist discipline practices in general, the really high push-out rate that's not being addressed, the lack of resourcing for the Afrocentric school and other Black-focused schools in Ontario, and a lot of these issues. And the director of the Toronto District School Board did come on that day, and we kind of have developed this, strategy of like cornering people who have a lot of power, cornering them in front of media and like asking them if they're gonna do stuff. So that's what we did that day with John Malloy, the director of the Toronto District School Board. We cornered him when he came out in front of the media, and we're like, are you gonna agree to do anti-Black racism training for all levels of your staff? And he's like, yeah, yes. And we're like, yes. And we're like, are you gonna agree to look at the school resource officer program? I don't know if you know, but little 6-year-olds are being handcuffed and children are being hurt and humiliated. And on that day was when he was like, yeah, I'm gonna take it back to the Toronto District School Board and I'm gonna inquire as per the status of the program. Because another part of the school resource officer program was that it was created during the 1990s, during something that media calls the Summer of the Gun. It was a summer when a lot of Black youth, a lot of Caribbean and East African Black youth were shot through gun violence. And so they came out afterwards with this program called TABIS, which was a program that was targeting certain neighborhoods with increased policing. And over the years, since that time, a lot of those programs, TABIS as overall has been completely gotten rid of because it was shown to be steeped in racial bias and racial profiling. And so, like, it was through TABIS that a lot of raids in Black communities happened, and a lot of the carding stuff happened through TABIS as well. And the school resource officer program was kind of like a leftover piece of TABIS that nobody really just remembered to get rid of. And so it was implemented after the Summer of the Gun. It was part of TABIS, and there was a lot of it done before they opened it. And even after they opened it, nobody was really sure what it was for. Like on the website of the Toronto Police Services, they were like, this program is not for safety, so there's no risk of anyone being criminalized. This program is for youth outreach. We're just outreaching to youth in their schools, so that if they ever have an issue, they know they can come to us. And we were like, that makes no sense. There's so many different ways to outreach to youth without putting them in danger and making them feel scared at school. But then once the program started catching heat and being talked about, they kind of switched it and they were like, well, we need this program for safety. And we were like, well, if you need it for safety, you shouldn't have put it in only majority Black neighborhoods in North and West Toronto. You should have put it everywhere because that's a human rights issue. So the activism around the school resource officer program started to happen at the level of the Toronto Police Services. And there was one night when we went to their board meeting and like 40 different Black parents went one after the other with deputations. They're like, this is why my kid feels scared going to school. This is what happened to my child because of the SRO program. Just back to back to back. It was like a flood of emotions coming out around this program. Youth talked about how, they had been detained by an officer at school because they had pencil shavings in their bag and the police had said it was weed, and stuff like that. Like, it was just ridiculous. So despite all that, the Toronto Police Services was like, we still like this program, we're gonna keep it. And it was the Toronto District School Board that actually decided to do some research into the program. And what was special about the research was they decided to take a different kind of lens. They didn't just ask if most kids liked the program or if most kids were comfortable with the program. They focused on the most vulnerable students. So they asked, Black and racialized students, indigenous students, students with disabilities, marginalized students, what their experiences had been. And when that kind of data came out is when they really realized the impact of this program on our communities. So at the level of the Toronto District School Board, which is the biggest board in Canada, they decided to cancel the program. And the ripples of that have been really powerful, with communities feeling like we can fight and have big goals around addressing policing and we can win. And even like some youth in Los Angeles and different cities in the States have contacted us about like how they can then start to fight against policing in their schools too. So this is the day that the TDSB decided to get rid of the SRO program. So we all celebrated. And that's my daughter. I have a virus, sorry. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about in terms of the work that we're doing inside and outside of the system. And beyond that, I really wanted to know about what the work y'all are wanting to do, are endeavoring to do, are thinking about. I know the context of Toronto is different from the context of other places in Ontario, but I do see Freedom School as not only like a program or a school, but part of a movement of community self-determined education. So if there's ways that we can support that conversation here, I would love to, participate in that.